Okay, good evening, everyone. Welcome to Holocaust Educational Trust Film Club. Here we are today. My name is Ben Fuller. I'm an education officer at the Holocaust Educational Trust, and I'll be talking to you for the next half an hour or so about this week's chosen film, which is Son of Saul, the directorial debut of Laszlo Nemes, an Hungarian-funded film. Laszlo Nemes grew up in France and initially was going to make it a French protagonist, but we'll come to that shortly. But it's a film about a Hungarian Jewish member of the Sonderkommando, the very specific group of inmates at Auschwitz who were tasked with working in and around the gas chambers. And his experiences. So I'm going to give a bit of an overview of the film in a couple of minutes, and just so that we kind of are at the same point on that one, and talk about some of the key issues. And I think today we're going to sort of focus a lot on nailing down some of the history and some of the historical accuracies that are there in the film. It's certainly not one that we would recommend as a teaching aid. So for the teachers that are with us this afternoon, lovely to have you. We're not recommending this film for classroom, but you might want to watch it or perhaps recommend for some of your older students if you think they can cope. But it is a very harrowing film. In fact, it is kind of going into the spaces of the Holocaust that rarely films venture, and so to spend the whole of a film situated in and around the gas chambers at Auschwitz-Birkenau was a very ambitious project from the start. And actually, as I mentioned a second ago, Laszlo Nemes was going to situate it with a French protagonist and make it kind of a French film, as it were, but the French, along with various other nationalities, didn't want to fund it. So, for example, France, Israel, Germany, Austria turned down the project, thinking it might be a bit too risky, but the Hungarian state actually funded 25% of the film. So they bought into the concept, and maybe some of the kind of the issues around why Hungary may have chosen to join this project. We can discuss in a little bit, because Hungary certainly has an interesting relationship to the Holocaust itself, insofar as the Hungarian state was a collaborator state for a long time during the war, and has had difficulties coming to terms with that in its own memory culture. However, to get back to the film, it won a whole bunch of awards, very, very positively received, despite the fact that it is in a controversial space of cinema. And the essence of the film is that it follows our main character, Saul Auslander, as who is a member of the Sonderkommando. Like I said, these people were tasked with doing essentially the dirty work of the Nazis in the gas chambers at Auschwitz. And across the death camps, the Nazis would have inmates operating pretty much everything but the actual administration of the different methods of killing. So in Auschwitz, that was the Zyklon B pellets that would be dropped through the roof, and once they effervesce at a certain temperature, then they become noxious fumes that would kill people. And in the other concentration camps, they were, with the exception of Majdanek, they would use exhaust fumes. And so that role would be for an SS guard, but everything else around the death camp itself and that element of Auschwitz was done by the inmates. So they worked in squads. They would usually work for a few months before the Nazis would liquidate them themselves, would murder them in the gas chambers. And as we join the film, then Saul is already working in the gas chambers. He's obviously been there for quite a while, and we have this first scene which lasts about 7.5 minutes with this incredibly close camera on his face as he goes about doing the job of bringing a transport into the gas chambers and helping them with taking their clothes off and trying to organize that whole situation, and then afterwards having to clean up. So right from the start, we get a sense that this is going to be a film that is going to really, really challenge us. There's a lot going on, despite the fact that the camera work is kind of around the head and shoulders of our main protagonist. We can see over his shoulder and see what's happening, and there's a very clear and very sort of intentional camera work that Laszlo Nemes used there. He even said that the camera would be his companion and would stay with him throughout his hell, and that the staying with Saul means not going beyond his field of vision, his hearing, and his presence. But there is an awful lot going on behind Saul himself and behind the scenes that we do hear that gives us information about what's happening. In the opening scene, Saul discovers the body of a young boy who has miraculously survived the gassing in Auschwitz, and he is taken into a side room where the SS doctors inspect the body, they kill him, and Saul feels like this is his son. Now, it's never made absolutely clear in the film if it is or isn't. There are certainly there are certainly kind of different ideas going on in the film, but I think possibly the way I see it is that he's not really his son, but this is Saul trying to make some kind of act of atonement, some kind of act of humanity, and he's picked up this child and thought, this is how I can do this. This is how I can kind of express some sense of humanness in the absolute disarray that is all around, and it is. And it's kind of left to the viewer to decide there. There's discussions throughout the film as to whether or not he has a son. He says that it's a son from out of his marriage, but it's a kind of question that's left hanging. And as Saul goes through as the film progresses, Saul is trying desperately to find a rabbi in order to give this child a honourable burial, complete with saying of the Kaddish, which is the Jewish prayer for the dead, and a personal burial. So this is that's the kind of the main kind of story arc that we're looking at. But as Saul goes through this process of trying to find someone, he is getting sort of roped into activities around the uprising, which took place on October the 7th, 1944. So we can place the film in space and time as a result of that. But there are things that go on in the film that don't fit the exact narrative of that. And one of the, I just want to pick up on a few questions and comments that people made before we sort of get into some of these issues. So we had someone on Twitter, Dr. Ritima, or is it, I'm not sure if it's a doctor, D.H. Ritma, I'm not sure if I've pronounced that right, it's one of those awkward Twitter handles, but this, that they say, is the film based on real events? I'm going to come to that very shortly. There's real events depicted in the film, but the film is not a non-fiction work, it's a fictional piece. PDig1 says, it's interesting that before the showers they made out people would have jobs and work after. One guard saying, come and find me personally. Was this to help manage the crowd or an act of kindness? I'll just answer that one quickly before I move on, because that was all part of the lie that the Nazis gave in order to try and subdue crowds as they brought them into the gas chambers on arrival at Auschwitz. And I think it's probably worth just stopping for a sec to say that by and large, people that arrived at Auschwitz didn't know where they were arriving to, didn't know what was going to happen to them, and so the Nazis employed these tactics of lying and saying that you're going to go for a shower, you're going to be well fed afterwards, if you hurry up now then you'll be able to get your soup or whatever. All of this was in order to subdue the crowds that were there and to try and quell any anguish. So that would have been a Nazi guard saying that. It wasn't something, to the best of my knowledge, that the Sonderkommando prisoners would have said, although there is a question there about what the communication that Sonderkommando prisoners did have, and from the reading I've done, to a large extent, it really was a case of not saying much at all, and speaking to the incoming Jewish people as just to assist them as much as possible. So the kind of rationale for that is, broadly speaking, why worry the people that I know what's going to happen to them, but in these last moments, do they need that additional anguish? And I don't think we have necessarily answers for these questions, because we are talking about a kind of otherworldly situation. It's in a moral sphere that we would hope that none of us would ever have to face, and we really can't understand. And there's some big controversy and big issues around representing a space like this because of those things. Primo Levi said of the gas chamber, referring to the gas chambers and referring to the Holocaust in general, he said, "We, the survivors, are not the true witnesses." And this speaks to the fact that what happened in these places are things that really we don't know a great deal about, because the huge majority of those who were there didn't survive to be able to tell the story. I'll just pick up on a few other comments before I move on with those thoughts. We've got loads of comments, but I just wanted to pick up. There's a few that said they didn't like it at all. Jackie Young being one of them. Jackie, if you're watching, then do add a comment to say why you didn't like it. I think it's absolutely fair to find the film not enjoyable and to not like it, but I'd be really interested to know what it was that you didn't like about it. Not the only person who said they didn't enjoy the film. There were several people like that, or I think maybe enjoy is the wrong word, but just didn't like it as a work. But there is also some positive comments about it. So Mr. B's History saying, "I think it does a wonderful job of showing the power of personal identity and faith in the face of such incomprehensible horror." And I think that is very much a part of what the film is attempting to do, to really express this feeling of humanity in the most inhuman of spaces that you could really imagine, or even can't imagine, to be honest. Dr. Anna Scanlon says, to that end, it leaves us with the debate of whether the film should educate or serve an artistic purpose, which I think is a really good comment, and I'll come back to about how far this is a film, or any film has a job in educating, or whether we accept it as a work of art and take it from there. Jan Kellen says, "To me, Son of Saul is one of very few movies that manages to describe the unrelenting chaos and horror of the Holocaust to the viewer without giving us the false notion that it can ever really be comprehended by those of us who were not there." And I think that's a really interesting comment. So thank you, Jan. That it is expressing an experience, but it's also, we have to acknowledge that we can never understand it, we can't comprehend it. And I think perhaps that's part of the reason why the camera work is so close, so that it doesn't take that sort of step back, which shows a whole scene unfolding, because that is beyond the ability of any filmmaker to create, let alone any viewer to comprehend. So I think that's kind of what might be going on there, but I do think it's a really valuable comment, so thank you. Jackie Young says, "I saw the film and didn't like it at all, probably because it was too close to the real thing." And I certainly think that there is something in that the filmmaker is not pulling any punches. They very deliberately were not trying to make a horror film, as horrific as it is, but what they were trying to do was bring you into that space, and I think through the character of Saul develop some sense of empathy, rather than it being just this constant shocking scenes. Someone, Ashley Freeman here, says, "This film of all Holocaust films made is the most shocking and graphic account, and in my view, because of that, is a must-see for all." That's a really interesting comment, to suggest that this therefore becomes a must-see film for all people. I think that right at the top of the show, I've just said this is not something that we would recommend to go through into the classroom. Perhaps an older viewer or older people who feel that they want to engage with learning about certain aspects of the Holocaust, this can be useful. I'm certainly not going to say it's a must-see, because I don't think that any film probably is a must-see, but I think it's a really interesting thing to say, especially in light of all of the other films that we've discussed and all of those ones that would maybe be considered must-see viewing. Just finally, before I get stuck into the technical stuff and the history within the film, it's worth maybe picking up on a couple of comments from significant interested parties. It's interesting to me reading that Cloud Landsman, who was the director of an sort of a major epoch-defining documentary called Shoah, which is about 9 hours long. So if you've got a spare weekend, which I guess we all have at the minute, then and you really want to, then get stuck into that. That's a documentary interviewing people from the perpetrator, the victim, and the bystander side, and he very much has that as his kind of narrative sort of sectioning off people. But he felt, and he's someone who's historically been against the kind of dramatization of Holocaust in film, and against fictional accounts, but he seemed to like it. He said it was a film that gives a very real sense of what it was like to be in the Sonderkommando. It's not at all melodramatic. It's done with very great modesty. So high praise indeed from him. So let's get stuck into seeing about what stuff in the film is representative, is useful, can we learn from, and what stuff about the film is maybe not so useful. As I've said, this is a fictional story. There isn't a character called Saul Ausländer who existed and went through this process, but what he did experience in the film are things that did happen. So, like I said, it references the Sonderkommando uprising of October the 7th, 1944, which I'll come back to in a few minutes. But there's also, let's just kind of back up to some of the key stuff that we do see in the film, and address the accuracy of the representations there. And I would say representation is a key word. It's not trying to portray a like for like happening in any of these situations, but it is trying to give us an indication of what took place. So we see his work in the gas chambers and all the horrific stuff that involved, and there's I know that Nemes took a lot of inspiration from reading accounts from Sonderkommando survivors and those that didn't survive. The Sonderkommando went to great efforts to bury evidence of what had happened. So people like Zalman Grodowski, who wrote a great deal of stuff and stuffed it into drinks containers that were buried in the ground and subsequently found after the war. So that's the kind of source material that Nemes was using to kind of generate a picture of what was happening in the film. A few kind of interesting scenes. There's one where he's sent to help. He says he will be able to work as a locksmith, to work on a door, and he's acting as a lookout for a cameraman who's going to take a picture of bodies being burned on open pyres. This is a reference to photographs that were taken in the summer of 1944, so it's not in the right time with the film, and it's an example of the film kind of taking things and sort of mixing up the time frame because it wants to fit it into this very condensed space. But those photos happen, and I think that's one of the most remarkable acts of resistance that really took place, because right in the heart of the most hellish part of Auschwitz, they were able to smuggle a camera through, to find the moment to take these photos and to smuggle those pictures out, which is an incredibly brave thing of those people to do. In order for them to be able to do that, and this links into another scene in the film, that we see the kind of the relationship between the Sonderkommando in different parts of the camp, specifically the area known as Canada, which was the storehouses in Auschwitz, where all of the possessions that had been stolen from the Jews who'd arrived were sorted, and either, if they were gold, they were melted down and sent to the Reich Bank. If they were clothing, they were sent back for the Winter Aid clothing distributions in mainland Germany, as it were. And Saul goes across to this space to collect a package which turns out to be gunpowder from the women working in Canada. And I think as we sort of come towards the part of the story where we pick up on the uprising itself, it's really worth pointing out that the role of the women who got hold of these things and managed to smuggle weapons or gunpowder or whatever it was into the camp is a remarkable story again in itself. And I guess this, just picking up on generally resistance in Auschwitz, there was always resistance activities going on, whether they be physical resistance against the Nazis or more spiritual or personal resistance of maintaining this sort of level of humanity, which I think is what Saul himself is really attempting to do. So there's an awful lot going on with this kind of idea of resistance, but bringing in those really important players is something that the film clearly aims to do, and just give us a sense that this is something that took place. And I think it's a good sort of nod towards those incredibly brave women who put their lives on the line and took those actions to supply the necessary equipment for the uprising to take place around the gas chambers. We also witness Saul as he on his sort of quest to find a rabbi. He finds his way down to the riverside where we see inmates shoveling human ash into the river, which is what happened. There's two rivers near Auschwitz, the Vistula and the Sola, and as one of the ways of disposing of the evidence and the giant mountains of human remains that the gas chambers generated, those ashes were simply chucked into the river. And so again, whilst the activity of the scene is not something, or the story-based activity of the scene is not something that is a representation of the past, the activity of what the Sonderkommando are doing there is something that did happen. And likewise, later on in the film, in the evening time, Saul is still looking for a rabbi and finds that there's a transport that being sent to a burning pit and being shot directly into that pit. Again, it's a harrowing scene. The sights, the sounds around it, even despite the fact you can't see everything up close and personal, it's very much, you're very aware, it's very claustrophobic, it's very intense viewing. And again, this is representative of what took place. One of the common misconceptions about Auschwitz, the gas chambers, the Holocaust in general, is that there was this sense of smoothness and there was a sense of control and efficiency to it all. And the reality is that on every level there was chaos. And the gas chamber, the crematoria, couldn't handle the amount of people that were being sent through. Notice in the film how the Nazis referred to the people as pieces, part of the dehumanization on every single level that the Nazis engaged in this process. And people were being shot directly into pits and at times when there was more people coming into the camp than the gas chambers themselves could cope with. So again, there's various elements of the film that show us, give us an impression of the reality. Even the reference to different capos. So capos were prisoners with different levels of responsibility. So there would be a capo in charge of it in each barracks in the camp. The Sonderkommando themselves never lived. Once they'd been put into the Sonderkommando group, they never would, apart from very rare occasions, would ever leave the gas chamber complex that they were attached to, which just shows how difficult it would have been to communicate and to generate all that was needed for the revolt to take place. So the Sonderkommando themselves, you'll have also noticed they weren't wearing the striped uniforms like we expect when we are kind of discussing Auschwitz Jewish inmates. And again, they didn't have to wear the striped uniforms. They would live, by the end of the war, they were living, or by the end of the period of the gas chambers anyway, they were living in the roof of the crematoria. And they actually had, in some ways, better circumstances. So they had more to eat and drink. They weren't they didn't have to wear the striped uniforms. They were given in a very strange way, and it's hard for me to even say it because of the job they were doing, but there was a certain amount of privilege awarded to them. So even being referred to by their name was something that was more commonplace in the Sonderkommando, partly because those prisoners were in much more regular contact with a smaller and more select group of Nazi guards. So there's some really interesting stories of the more sort of normal communication between the guard and the prisoner in the Sonderkommando than perhaps at most other sites where guard and prisoner would be in communication. So all of these things are kind of filtered into this film in a way that is very confusing and very kind of claustrophobic, as I said, but this is all the stuff that he's going through. So just to pick up on kind of the way that it's portrayed, one of the sort of most controversial spaces to take film into, I think, is the gas chamber. As I mentioned earlier, Levy said, we're not the witnesses. We're not the witnesses of that space. And Barry Langford, a scholar of Holocaust film, also sort of referred to this when he said the door of the gas chamber becomes a literal threshold of unrepresentability, a physical and textual marker of the point beyond which depiction ceases to be permissible or even possible. So I guess that's a really interesting quote, because he said it ceases to be permissible to go into the gas chamber and to represent that moment. And what this film does is not attempt to represent the unknown. The character of Saul is based on, as I said, testimony and survivor comments that tell us the actions that a Sonderkommando member would have to take. What we don't see is what goes on once the door is shut inside the gas chamber. We hear it, and we know the noise that we hear at that moment is a representative based on accounts, but we don't go inside. And I think, interestingly, last week when we were discussing The Boy in the Striped Pajamas, that film actually does, which I think I said last time, I found that quite remarkable, that a film that's designed for children was willing to go to that point of seeing from the view of inside the gas chamber, seeing the SS pouring in the Zyklon beer. And for me, I felt that was a little bit I'm not sure how respectful that was of the history, but we don't need to bang on about that film anymore, do we? So this film kind of goes to the very threshold. I'd argue that it doesn't go beyond that by maintaining our sort of closeness to Saul and staying the other side of the door. It doesn't attempt to show what some people would say is unrepresentable and we don't understand and not possible. But what the film does do is is sort of develop this character of Saul and attempt to sort of express this sense of humanity. And I think that that's really worth picking up on, because when we look at his facial expressions in those first few minutes of the film, we're seeing someone who is devoid of emotion, who's purely doing the things that are right in front of him. I think there's a kind of symmetry between the fact that the camera is so close to him, which obviously, as we've heard from the director, was part of taking us on his journey, but also speaks maybe to his sort of sense of a lack of peripheral vision. He's blocking out everything that he possibly can in order to make this as bearable as possible. And again, those who worked in the Sonderkommando were at the very forefront of the height of the Nazi atrocities, and was an incredibly difficult thing for any member to be able to cope with. And it's been various people that spoke about it said that a lot of members committed suicide afterwards, during their time. Within a couple of days, they just couldn't feel that they could be a part of it. Others decided that they wanted to survive to be able to tell the story. And there's even a story of a member of the Sonderkommando who, in his despair, walked into the gas chamber and shut the door behind him with a group of women who'd been brought in to be murdered, and they turned to him and said, "What are you doing here? You know what happens. You're in a job where you might survive. Get the hell out and survive and tell the world what's taken place here." And he did, and he did survive, and he was able to tell the story of the gas chambers. So I think that with our character of Saul, he's got this sense of numbness, but then when he sees this child, regardless of whether it's his or not, he sees an opportunity for committing an act of humanity. And I think that that's a really important thing for us to understand about the film, and that this is a person who's trying to cling on to the lost humanity that has been stripped from him by the Nazis in everything that they've done and everything that they've attempted to do. And whether or not it's his child is kind of immaterial. The point is he's doing something that is the right thing to do. I think I've lost my thread there for a second, guys, because there was another point on that, but I'm going to have to come back to it. So just to have a look, I'm just going to scroll through some of the comments that people have made. Yes, so Steve Richardson asked if it was deliberate to restrict the view, and it absolutely was. And you may have noticed, because we've all got widescreen TVs these days, but the camera kind of has the black bars on either side, which is not how you generally film in this day and age. But it is there to constrict the view of you and sort of reflect perhaps Saul's constricted views. And Ingrid also comments on this, saying that to see it through Saul's eyes, the viewer becomes him. And I think that very much is what the aim of the film is, to see things through his eyes, to experience his experience, and what happens around him, we experience that through him. I'm going to just scroll through a couple of others. The issue it deals of what is resistance is fascinating. Is the armed rebellion a more effective resistance than taking and hiding photos or written documents? And I think that's a really important question, and you know, something that we would encourage teachers to look at in schools is how many different types of resistance there were, and what the material gains of different types of resistance were. So resistance doesn't necessarily have to mean survival. It doesn't have to mean bringing down the Nazis. It can be sacrificial resistance, as I think a lot of what we've discussed in previous episodes of Film Club relate to. And I think that what we get to see here is that he's sort of determined to make an act of resistance that is a personal act, but then he's involved with this uprising. And I'll come to the uprising in a second, because that's a huge story which is crammed into this situation. What we do get to understand from the film, what is a representative of the reality, is that this uprising was a carefully planned event that eventually happens at the wrong time, essentially. When the Sonderkommando realise that their names are being written down to be put into the gas chambers themselves, then they know they have to act. And so, as such, the preparations for the revolt go out the window, and it becomes a much more ad hoc fight for survival than it initially would have been. And throughout the whole of the Auschwitz camp, there was a kind of resistance group that managed to communicate across the different parts of the camp, and thus when this revolt started, that was a trigger to encourage other revolts to pick up. The reality was, because of the lack of because it didn't happen exactly to plan, that that sort of knock-on effect also didn't happen, which meant that it wasn't the success that they'd have hoped. I mean, realistically, I don't know how successful it ever could have been, because of exactly what they were facing. It's worth noting that right at the end of the film, when they've got outside of the camp fence, they're still within they'd still have another 40 odd kilometers to go to get out of what was known as the Auschwitz zone of interest, which was very heavily guarded all around. So the chances of survival were incredibly slim, regardless of any of the circumstances. But what the film does tell us is that the revolt happened not to plan, but as a result of those who were planning it realizing that their time was up, and that it was a now or never moment. Ashley Freeman says, I cry through most Holocaust films, but this one you're more stone cold and in shock, and at the end would you and only at the end would you show the emotion. I think that's a really interesting comment, and I think maybe that's a comment on the way that the film is sort of brought to you, that there isn't that sense of distance where like in most films that we see regardless, but particularly the Holocaust films, like to reference Schindler's List perhaps, where you have that grandstand view of the whole thing, and therefore the shocking elements affect you in the moment. Whereas looking at it through Saul's eyes, or through Saul's position, there's this intensity and this sort of constant movement that really restricts you from displaying emotion in the moment. And it's only afterwards that you do kind of realize what is happening. And I think perhaps again that's kind of how Saul is. Saul, the actor who played Saul, whose name has just escaped me, Geza Röhrig, apologise for the pronunciation there, but he's lacking in emotion, and it's only right at the very end when he sees that child that he breaks a smile, and that's the first change of expression really in the whole film from him. So I think that's an important thing to pick up on, so thank you for that comment. I'm just realising that we are well over time, so I'm going to just have a look for one or two other comments. I'm going to look at the short ones because it's quicker. Wow, Ingrid is on fire this afternoon. Thank you for all your comments, and you've made a good point there to say that the songs on the Commander were usually replaced approximately every 3 months. Usually, again, all of these things lack a very careful clarity, and there were people that survived a lot longer than that, but on average, yes, about 3 months was right. Natalie Evans is recommending Philip Muller, who was one of the Sonderkommando who survived and wrote about his experiences. I also mentioned Salman Grodowski, and you can find their writings online. Okie dokie. So I feel like there's still so much more that we could discuss on this film, and I feel a bit guilty that we've maybe not covered some of the things that I would like to. But time, as ever, has got away from us. So I'm just gonna finish off. I wanted to pick up on one of the comments from earlier, and I've just got to find it. Aha! Leaves us. This is from Dr. Anna Scanlon. To that end, it leaves us with the debate of whether film should educate or serve an artistic purpose. And I think this particular film is kind of straddling that line. It is. I think there is a sort of educational element to it. Not that I'm suggesting it's a sort of classroom educational element, because of the sheer horror and brutality. And we strongly believe that we don't need to use graphic imagery to teach about the Holocaust, and we certainly don't want to bring things into the classroom that have potentially traumatic effects on our students. And this film is very, very hard going. So we have to recognise that. But we can learn from this film. It is giving a representation very much in the realism, but there is, I think, I would probably argue that what the director's done quite well is to not try and create a documentary of how the gas chambers worked, but leave us to figure some stuff out from what's going on in the background. So yeah, really a powerful film. I hope that you felt like you gained something from watching it, and really appreciate all the comments that you've sent in to support me in preparing for this. Next week, well, 2 weeks time, we'll be looking at the film The Reader, which is a post-war film that references back, and I won't tell you any more because I don't want to spoil it for you, but it will bring up some, I think, interesting discussion points about post-war guilt, post-war attitudes, kind of where we draw the line in terms of how responsibility, all of these kind of things. So really encourage you to watch that. I believe it's on Amazon. I think it's a rental. It's not on the Prime at the moment, but it's there or thereabouts. So The Reader is the next film. And one last thing that I just want to say before I head off, and leave you to your evenings, is to encourage you to go and get a nice cup of tea. It's raining where I am, so there's nothing else to do, and come back to the Holocaust Educational Trust Facebook page at 6 o'clock, where Marla Tribich is going to be sharing her testimony of survival through the Holocaust. She's an incredible speaker, she's an incredible woman, and I really couldn't recommend highly enough hearing her story and learning about what she experienced. She's speaking to our Holocaust Educational Trust Young Ambassadors, and we are live streaming that presentation for anyone to view. So really would encourage you to stick around for that. It's going to be well worth a watch. Yes, and in the meantime, before I see you again in 2 weeks, I hope you have a lovely couple of weeks. I hope the weather perks up a bit, because it's a lot easier, isn't it, in a minute when the sun's out. And it's been great to speak with you again. So thanks for joining us, and we'll see you again soon. Bye, guys.